Tuesday at 6 o'clock from now on. Today we've got Kit Opie in, who's talking about the evolution of democracy.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. Are we going to leave that door open just so I know whether people are likely to walk behind me? Well, good evening and hello again to some of you, because I was in a lecture at 9 o'clock this morning along with some of you, so we know how it is starting that early and keeping going. And actually, if there are any first years here, then I'm doing a lecture tomorrow morning at 10 on kinship. So I might have lost a bit of my voice by that point. I am going to record this this talk. It's just for my own purposes, although I heard that some people did want to listen to it afterwards, but that wasn't really the point. It was just so that I could get a sense of what it's like to be on the other side. But I'll turn off the recording as soon as I've finished and any of you are speaking, so you don't need to worry about that. And I have to give a sort of a warning, I suppose, especially if there's anybody who's here who's not an anthropologist, because that would be concerning, because I might walk a little roughshod over quite a lot of stuff. And please afterwards do pick me up on things, but I'm not a historian, and it may be that I've picked things up that are not quite right. But my interest, as some of you will already know, is in trying to use methods and theory from evolutionary biology to start having a look at human evolution and more recently, how humans live now and possibly making predictions about the future. And I don't know what it's been like for you over the last few years, but politics seems to have gone completely and utterly crazy. And this word, democracy, gets bandied around by everybody, on both sides of the argument, or many different sides of the argument. Oh, we're being democratic, you're being undemocratic, all this kind of stuff. And it started getting me thinking about... Hi. It's all right. It started getting me thinking, well, where does this idea of democracy even come from? And how has it developed? And where, and where maybe is it going with all this kind of contested stuff? So this is very early in my thoughts about this. Most of the reading that I've done for this was over this summer. So I'm still trying to grapple with the ideas, and I'd be really interested in getting your reaction, comments for and against, questions about it and so on. So to see whether it's possible for us to go a little bit further than this, dare I say it, if there are any second years, who are thinking about dissertation projects, this could possibly be one, or even third years who haven't quite settled yet. I'm not being entirely serious, but there might be ways of collecting data that could be useful to look at this particular question. Okay, so it's undoubtedly the case that politics, democracy is really, really contested at the moment. Of course, we here in the UK are trying to grapple with this Brexit problem, and all the sort of things that are going along with that. But it's not just here. We have, as we speak, there are amazing protests, demonstrations, whatever you want to call them, in Hong Kong, which again are about the nature of democracy that they're under, and in many other parts of the world. So as I said, I'm interested in looking back and trying to get some sense of what this rather slippery concept is all about. So I'm going to go back. You may be somewhat surprised to find. I'm going to go back to the Black Death. This was an absolutely calamitous event that took place in the middle of the 14th century when fleas riding on the backs of rats passed this plague around, and over this 4-year period about 50% of the population of Europe died. Now, why I think this is particularly important is because 30 years later we get an amazing protest in England. I don't know whether this is mirrored across the rest of Europe that was equally affected by the Black Death, but in England at least there was an absolutely momentous uprising by the people called the Peasants' Revolt, and it was mainly sort of East Anglia across to Suffolk and Essex, and then down to Kent and so on. So it was, within walking distance, well, quite a long walking distance of London, but huge numbers of people got involved in this very large protest, basically because of the shortage of labour due to the Black Death. 50% of people had died, and therefore wages were going up, but taxes were also going up hugely, and serfdom was still the main way in which people were employed, I guess you could say. I mean, it's basically medieval style slavery, and the demands of these peasants. I mean, not all of them were peasants, and many of them were free folk. And the demands that they made were to reduce the amount of taxation that was being levied on free men, and to end serfdom. So basically, to abolish slavery a lot earlier than some people kind of suggest. Now, I mean, I think this is the most amazing uprising, and absolutely fantastic. And given my life over again, maybe I would like to do history, I think, and kind of study these kinds of events. But it seems to me that the demands that are being made by these people are very much like kind of trade union demands, if you like. I mean, obviously of their time, but they were economic demands. They were reducing taxation. Yes, okay, slavery is kind of a bit beyond economic, but it was the way in which they were forced to work, and it was demands over that that these peasants were making. They were not challenging who was running the country. They went to the king, young, is it? I don't even know who it is. Is it Richard II? Someone like that. Very young king, asking, making a petition to the king. Not in any way suggesting that the king should move over or any of that kind of thing. They didn't want control. They just simply wanted a better life for themselves and the people that they were doing this on behalf of. Okay, so let's run forward 300 years. You can see how I'm kind of chopping up history rather. As if there's anybody who's like actually studied history, please be gentle with me. So we run forward sort of almost 300 years, certainly 300 years since the Black Death, to the English Civil War. Now, this is a very different affair. These are not economic demands that the so-called parliamentarians are raising. These are political demands that they're raising. They're not talking about taxes or the ways of employment or serfdom, pretty much gone by this point, or anything like that. They were directly challenging the way in which England was run. And they wanted to run it themselves. So they were challenging the king, Charles I, and they eventually ended up, of course, with beheading the guy and imposing a parliament in order to run England. So a totally different sort of, it's more than protest, uprising or whatever. Now I don't know, and I'd be really interested to find out whether, again, this kind of thing was happening in other parts of Europe, whether this kind of change from sort of economic type demands for, a better life, effectively, to political demands about the way in which we are controlled within our life is concerned. But it's interesting to note that there was some major invention that took place in between these two uprisings or whatever you may call them. And that was the invention of the printing press in 1439. Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz printed the first book with something similar to this kind of printing press. And the likes of Elizabeth Eisenstein, who wrote The Printing Revolution in early modern Europe, attributes huge amount of impact to this invention. She argues that the printing press had two main effects on the society in early modern Europe. The first was in terms of religion. So her argument is that, and it's sort of supported by the facts, that within less than a century of the invention of printing press, and by the way, once the printing press had been invented, the spread of it was incredibly fast. I mean, we think now of, the spread of kind of our technologies, of maybe of smartphones and so on. This was almost on that kind of a scale. Within 50 years, there were printing presses right the way across Europe. In not just like capital cities and things, but in small towns and all of that kind of thing. It was absolutely incredible. And in less than a century later, Martin Luther had raised his protest at the way in which the Catholic Church determines the way that the religion works, and he had been excommunicated. Now, the particular way in which these sorts of protests were taking place was very much based on printed material. So he printed leaflets and circulated them with his kind of demands of the papacy, and other people were also using the printing press for kind of propaganda kind of purposes. In fact, you may have noticed as you were walking in tonight, or you may have noticed, coming to this building at another time, this amazing series of pictures that and if you hadn't kind of had a good look at it, as you're leaving the building, do have a look, because this is the kind of cartoon story of William Tyndall, and he was also part of this kind of movement that Elizabeth Eisenstein is talking about, and he actually was the first one to translate the Bible into English and print it. And I think there's maybe some of these pictures up at the top is actually of him getting that first Bible printed, and you can see the reaction that takes place in England. The books are burnt. He is then arrested, held in a cell, and eventually in 1535 he's burnt at the stake for this absolutely heretical and appalling thing of translating the Bible from Latin into English and then printing it. And the reason why this stained glass window is in this building is because just behind here, I mean literally behind here, was kept a copy of that first printed Bible in English. I mean, I think there's even, yes, I think you can even see the door here of the safe that was built in order to keep this Bible that had caused, obviously, so much trouble to him personally, but was very emblematic of the changes that were taking place within religion. And the ideas here are quite simple, that the printing press allows for the Bible to be printed. At last, it's possible to read it in your own language, not just here, but across Europe, and for it to be not cheap enough for most people to be able to buy a copy, obviously, and that's why they were keeping one of the printed copies in a safe, but at least so you could get much better access to it. And the idea came about of this kind of direct line between you and your God, that you could actually talk directly to your God. There was a personal relationship that was possible, which of course was never possible under traditional Roman Catholicism. That was always mediated by the priest, and the priest was the literate person within the community who would be able to tell you what was in this great book, the Word of God. And Elizabeth Eisenstein argues that it's not just religion that is affected in this way. So Newton here, who was born during the English Civil War, and is seen as one of the sort of the great scientists of the early modern period, came up with the phrase of standing on the shoulders of giants, and I think even Google Scholar uses that on their page. I have to tell you that, just as an aside, that he used that phrase as a put down. He was in an argument with, I think, a guy called Boyle, who he totally dismissed as some absolute thicko because he actually dealt with data. So, really completely beyond the pale. And he used this, of course, I'm standing on the shoulder of giants. He didn't believe that that was the case. He thought he was the only giant, but he said this in a kind of mocking way to to the person that he was arguing with. I just put that on one side. So anyway, also in science, the printing press has this amazing effect that data then becomes something that can be replicated. So you can, have a sheet of data, it can be printed, and then it can be circulated amongst all those people who are interested. So, astronomy, physics, all the sciences started off at this point because you could start having data that was shared and papers that were shared. So the Royal Society came about at this time as a way of sharing the results of different experiments and so on across the whole of science. But I think Elizabeth Eisenstein kind of stops short. She actually specifically says she's going to stop short, that she's not going to discuss politics. And that's a pity, I think, although, of course, then that gives us space to maybe go and have a look at what the effect of the printing press might have been. But she did, amazing work on the other two things, in any case. And what we have as far as politics, in the sort of very broadest sense, is that pamphlets like this, produced by the Levellers, who were a sort of political movement that flourished during the time of the Civil War, were putting out these kind of pamphlets, which is an agreement of the people for a firm and present peace upon grounds of common right and freedom. I mean, they were making explicit demands of the new setup, of the new parliament, for freedom and common rights, human rights for people across England. And they were using the printing press in order to do this. So it seems, at least there's sort of some circumstantial evidence to suggest that Elizabeth Eisenstein could have done some more work in this kind of area. Now, of course, writing had started a great deal earlier than this. So I'm not suggesting that we didn't have writing before, because of course the cuneiform script, which is the earliest script ever, invented about 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, or what is now southern Iraq, was invented and used, first of all, as a kind of bureaucratic tool to deal with the elementary functions of the state, taxes in particular, and other sorts of things in terms of state running. And this was copied, though not directly, in Egypt in order to produce the hieroglyphics there, which were used rather more for religious purposes or the purposes of the ruler, the pharaohs, and glorifying them rather than actually running the nitty-gritty of the state. But the same sort of thing. And these two inventions coincided very, very closely with the first states. I mean, they were the technology of these very earliest states. And about 1,500 years later, there was the invention of the alphabet, which meant instead of these two kind of very stationary states in what's now the Middle East, increasing their influence over other people in the area, but not really much movement beyond that. Then actually some Semitic slaves of the Egyptians used this kind of graffiti style symbols here to develop what we now as the alphabet. And this was the phonetic alphabet. So the Phoenicians developed this and then took this right away across the Mediterranean. And then it fell into the hands of the Greeks, and they made a few kind of slight changes of it. And of course, the rest we kind of know about. But in these societies, I mean, even in societies where they were using the alphabet, it was an absolutely tiny percentage of the population that you could imagine were what we would call literate. In the first societies, I mean, it was really only the scribes that were literate. So, you know, even the rulers, the likely rulers of those states probably, you know, only had a bit of an understanding. I mean, in cuneiform, there are 300 different symbols. I mean, that takes a lot of remembering. In fact, in the hieroglyphs at the peak, there were about 600 different symbols that people had to learn. And sorry, I digress slightly here, but the schooling of the people who ended up as the scribes of these very earliest writing forms is so similar to education now. It's kind of scary. They had to, you know, they had to go through, it was kind of quite a lot of rote learning. They had to write out their lines. They had to practice spelling, you know, all the kinds of things that now, you know, kids are expected to do in primary school. Some kind of suggestion that writing in itself, you know, enforces a particular way of learning. Anyway, that's a much longer kind of discussion. But a very, very few people there. Even when the alphabet starts to spread, I mean, we're talking about, you know, maybe 1% of the population, perhaps less, of merchants and others for whom the alphabet became kind of important in their lives. And then we get the printing press. And suddenly there is a much bigger number of people who are starting to, for whom literacy then becomes kind of important. I mean, I don't know what, again, what the kind of percentages were, but, you know, shall we say something like maybe 10% of the population start to get some kind of level of literacy so that they can read, you know, all this stuff that is being churned out by the printing presses. And we now move to a different person as my source. So Elizabeth Eisenstein was a historian, is a historian, I think, looking at the printing from that point of view. And then we've also got Marshall McLuhan, who was actually a professor of English based in Toronto, who was very interested in the impact of the printing press. And his suggestion was that, in fact, the printing press produced the public. That there hadn't been a public before the printing press started. So printing of books and pamphlets and maps and all different sorts of things that were coming off those printing presses allowed for individuals, a bit like in religion, that the individual is having a direct line of communication to his or her God. Now the reader is having a direct connection to the author or the writer of a particular pamphlet or book or whatever it may be. So, and this brought about a kind of self-consciousness at an individual level, that people started thinking about themselves, the characters in books as individuals, and the author as an individual, but that it was very visually based. So no longer, as we have in kind of stories or even, may I say, lectures, where, you know, you're looking and listening and kind of feeling emotions and so on. The book or the printed word is very, very fixed It's just visual. That's the only way that you can possibly take it in. Everything else goes to hell. So there's no kind of integration, this is Marshall McLuhan's argument, no integration of the whole of the self. Just simply this one of our senses is being used completely to the exclusion of others. And, he says, also at the group level, that people start getting a kind of self-consciousness of the reading public. You know, other people, oh, you read that book. Oh, right, I read it. What did you think? So they start to get an idea of being part of a public. And this seems to me to be an important change that might have a kind of an impact on what we're addressing here. So both at an individual level and at a group level. Now, of course, this is kind of conjecture, and I'm just using a couple of writers and so on, and what they happen to be saying. I got interested in it, as I say, over the summer and was kind of reading it. But is there anything anywhere that can kind of back any of this up? Sorry. First of all, the other idea of Marshall McLuhan's is, as well as forming a public, the printing press brought about the idea of the nation state. That there hadn't been a sense of the nation state before. Maybe amongst the rulers as they were jostling with each other for power across Europe, for sure. But amongst the majority of people, there was no sense of a nation state, because everything that was written in Latin anyway, and that was true right across Northern Europe. There were boundaries and so on. But suddenly the printing press started to make kind of containers. They started printing in English. So it was for an English reading public. And of course they wouldn't sell those books in France. They'd be printing books in French over there. And so you suddenly started having a kind of sense of, amongst this public, of a nation state, of somehow being separated off from the other nation states, because they were separate in terms of the reading matter that they were looking at, and in terms of the conversations and so on that were taking place. Still amongst this small group, I'll give you that, but it was starting to solidify like that. So, if we try and get some kind of sense of, well, what were the kind of literacy levels, this is the best I've come up with so far. I can't go back, I haven't been able to go back before 1800, but I mean that would kind of fit with about a 10% literacy rates, off the back of the printing press. And then you can see over the 2 centuries until now, a kind of slow progression in literacy, and then rates start to rise in the latter part of the 20th century. And it struck me that if you put that chart next to the chart of democracy, you get a rather interesting sort of similar movement. Now, okay, don't quote it at me. I'll quote it myself, so you won't have to. Correlation doesn't equal causation. I know. Just the fact that these 2 graphs are going in the same direction, I'm sure there are 100 different graphs that also do this kind of thing. I mean, you could have GDP, you could have probably even population, or a ton of different things that could be part of this. But I thought it was kind of interesting to see the ideas of someone like Marshall McLuhan, of suggesting that literacy might be linked to some kinds of notions of democracy. Now, if we're talking about democracy, let's not get off confusing this with Parliament. Now, the Levellers back in the Civil War were absolutely clear. They were calling for some kind of form of, you know, what we might now call democracy. They were calling on the Parliament to give that kind of democracy to the people, and they were, you know, comprehensively refused. There was no way the Parliament was going to do that. So Parliament and democracy are two completely separate, differentiated concepts and ideas, so that we now get this kind of confusion where politicians are starting to make sort of talk about, you know, the mother of all parliaments and all of this kind of stuff. Let me remind them and share with you that actually this phrase was used by John Wright back in 1865. He was a reformer, and his actual phrase was, "England is the mother of parliaments." And it was as a rebuke. He was saying that there is such a lack of democracy, so even though we have parliaments, and we've had parliaments for such a long time, this is not actually giving us the kinds of reforms that he was arguing for. And, you know, at the time, it was about 7% of the population could actually vote. You know, I mean, it's only, you know, 150 years ago or something, and only 7% of the population was voting at this time. So shouldn't be any confusion between Parliament on the one hand and democracy on the other. So let me just give you a little bit more sort of as we get towards the end, about what happened in terms of literacy in this country, at least. So in 1891, the first act was passed, which made primary schooling compulsory for everyone. So 5-year-olds in 1891 had to start going to school and started to learn how to read and write. I mean, very, very kind of basic at this level, and they only had to stay for the length of primary school. It wasn't until much later that secondary schools were made compulsory and so on, and maybe at some point university will be made compulsory, but we'll see. Maybe I'm just looking after my own job. So how does this link to democracy? Well, I think it's interesting that if you think of a 5-year-old in 1891 going to school for the first time, compulsory school, there had obviously been schools before, that 5-year-old male, let me say, that 5-year-old male would have been 32 by the time that he got the vote. So that seems to be like quite fast in a sense, that, you know, that from if there is a connection between literacy and democracy, then the fact that of all these people suddenly becoming literate, suddenly being able to read political pamphlets and get engaged in Marshall McLuhan's The Public, and within whatever it is, 22 years or whatever, all males then have suffrage, have the right to vote. We shouldn't crow about it too much, however, because it actually turns out that England was the 30th country to grant universal male suffrage. So mother of parliaments maybe, but is that then caveated by the 30th to bring in universal male suffrage? No, I don't think so. Then, of course, women as well, and 10 years later was universal suffrage. So now we have suffrage of both men and women. So the women then, if they'd started school as a 5-year-old back in 1891 would be 42 now, and they had quite a big fight on their hands in order to get the vote for women. But I'm suggesting that, again, if Marshall McLuhan is right, is that literacy is making a huge difference, that the suffragette pamphlets that are going round, the petitions that they're mounting and so on, now are engaging with people who are literate. We do slightly better as a country in terms of universal suffrage. We've moved up from 30th to 20th now, but again, I don't think it's necessarily something that those politicians talking about the mother of all parliaments are likely to crow about. And let me just tell you one thing, which I wasn't aware of, and you may not be, but universal suffrage at that point was at age 21, not at 18. So universal suffrage for those 18 and above was only brought in 1969, so 50 years ago as we speak. So democracy, or some kind of sense of democracy, is so incredibly new. I mean, it's, even universal male suffrage is just 100 years old. And to go with it, literacy is incredibly new. As we all think of it as being, of course, everybody in the UK is literate, of course. And there's a sense that has been around for such a long time, but actually it hasn't. It's only been around for a little over 100 years, and democracy also has been here for such a short time as well. Now, okay, I've been talking about these people, Eisenstein, McLuhan, and so on, with ideas from the humanities, which is absolutely great. But I'm an evolutionary anthropologist. I can't go a whole evening without mentioning Darwin and evolution. That's completely impossible. And so what I'm kind of thinking about is that actually, and some of you will be familiar with me discussing this, is that actually what we're talking about fits in with what Maynard Smith and Satmari describe as, or characterize as major transitions in evolution. Because these major transitions over the last 4 billion years, I hasten to add, and rather kind of large ones you may think compared to things like writing and printing. But these are transitions in the way that information is stored and transmitted. So in effect, it's the same as writing, it's the same as printing, a change in the way that information is stored and printed. And of course, the most important one, perhaps, from our point of view, is the evolution of humans and our ability to use language. And that was the way in which we can actually share information, on an evening like tonight. But then subsequent changes to that, and Maynard Smith and Satmari point to at least two of these. They point to the invention of writing and the invention of computer technology as ways of changing how information is stored and transmitted. And I would argue that maybe not as major as some of the others, but that the printing press also does that. Now, these evolutionary biologists identified what they saw as features of these major transitions. And the main one was that you had independent replicators who then become replicators together. It's a bit difficult to see quite how that fits in with printing, but Marshall McLuhan's ideas of the public, of people who become literate, becoming part of a public, I think does at least have echoes of this kind of thing. And once you're literate, Basically, there's no way back. You have moved from an oral-based society into a literate society. There's no way you are going to go back. Then there are other things that, other features that they bring in, but in particular, they bring in this idea of central control, that the way in which information is stored and transmitted determines how the organism, that is what they're talking about, but maybe we can talk about, society, the way that that society is controlled. And I wonder whether we could put democracy in that place. So once you have a society where the mass majority of people are literate, the way that you control that society has to change. It first changed, just in the advent, I would argue, of the printing press, and you got, uprisings like the English Civil War, and maybe there were others of a similar type in other parts of Europe. But when you get actually mass literacy, then I would say this kind of suggests that you get a change in the way that the society is controlled, and maybe democracy. Now, okay, that's all very well, but what does that mean for now? Well, I think we are now changing the way that information is stored and transmitted. We're all using these kinds of things and these kinds of things. We are no longer based in what could have been described as a literate society. In a sense, we're moving beyond a literate society. Yes, of course, we use literacy within this new technology. And Marshall McLuhan actually makes the argument that the new information technology always has the content of the previous information technology. So, printing used, books and ideas that had come out of writing. The invention of writing was using what we do in terms of language and speaking to each other. So it's obviously going to be the case that a new information technology is going to be using, at least to start with, the content from the previous, what we might call, literate society. But it's going to move beyond that, and we're already starting to move beyond that. So, we're using YouTube videos, we're using voice to text and text to voice. We're using so many more things than print had kind of squashed us down into this using of one single sense of vision. And that was all that we were allowed to see. I mean, he goes on about, the structure of the page. We can't see anything beyond the side of the page. It's only what's kind of encapsulated inside it and so on. We are now breaking free of all of that kind of stuff. We're no longer constrained by the printed page. We can have our information in all sorts of crazy ways. I mean, I tell the story about, illiterate, what we would call illiterate, non-literate peoples who are using WhatsApp to communicate over huge distances, because they can do, speech to text and text to speech at the other end. They don't care. They don't have to be literate anymore in order to engage in this new technology. And maybe, people have talked about new protest movements being sparked, or it's easier to organize them using WhatsApp or Facebook or Twitter or whatever it may be. But maybe it's actually that we're starting to think outside of the constraints that we were living under before. We're no longer bounded by the book. We can think beyond that, and we can think beyond that in how we want our society controlled. And I mean, Marshall McLuhan makes the statement. You can't read it all here, and he talks about the electric age, or and latterly the electronic age, but computers were fairly new when he was writing. But he says this new information technology, with its power of totally involving all people in all other people. And of course that's true. I mean, we know what's going on in Hong Kong. We know what's happened. Trump tweeted that the American troops were coming out, and already the Turks have gone and invaded Kurdish territories. And we know that that's happening, and we can see what's happening. We are involved in everybody else's lives, and no longer bounded by any kind of sense of geography. It doesn't make any difference how far away northern Syria is, or how far away Hong Kong is. We can be involved in those kinds of protests, maybe as bystanders, but there were people bystanding in the Peasants' Revolt as well. And Marshall McLuhan makes the argument that maybe by being freed of the kinds of information technology like writing and then subsequently printing, we can somehow get back to the sort of cooperation that we could expect within hunter-gatherer societies. And therefore, that puts us as anthropologists in a great position to actually test that proposal and come up with ideas about how that may be the case. So it's possible, if we move beyond the confines of the written word, of the book, of the text, we can find all of our senses being used. In our relationships with others, in our ways of using information and passing that information along. And we move away from a hierarchy that has been imposed, I think, to some extent by literacy. So in those very early states, we had only the people who either were literate or controlled the people who were literate in control of these massive, great empires of millions of people, many hundreds of thousands at least, and this very kind of linear hierarchy. Even after print, there was some questioning of those hierarchies, but we still ended up with a kind of hierarchy within democracy. Okay, sure, we have eventually we all have the right to vote, but it's not like we've got kind of equality to go with that democracy. And maybe the new kind of information technology is going to take us back more to a society which is more like hunter-gatherers. Now, let me not get too kind of sort of nostalgic for our very early origins or any of that kind of stuff. I know there are like 7 billion people on the planet, and we're facing a climate emergency and all of those kinds of things. It's not like the idyllic picture up here of hunter-gatherers in Central Africa. But maybe if we get unbounded from the very straitjacket of writing and literacy, we can start thinking about at least different ways in which we control society. We may call it democracy, and we may call it something else. Who knows? But I think the convulsions in democracy that we are currently seeing is because it's, on the one hand, it's actually very new, and so we don't really know how it works. And on the other hand, I think it's on its way out. It was something that was built on the back of mass literacy, and we're now moving beyond mass literacy. We're going to be in a post-literate society from now on. Thanks very much.